Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Make sure that you like, share, subscribe if you enjoy our content, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. So we do have a lot to talk about. Injuries are piling up for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Rutger McGroarty's name has been added to that list, so we have to discuss that and the impact of his potential missing of some time here. Mike Sullivan shifted the top of the Penguins lineup, and I think there's something that we'd all love to see before the season's over in the next 3 games. But before we get into any of that, we obviously got the news just a couple hours ago that the hockey world has lost a terrific person. Former Pittsburgh Penguins general manager Ray Shero has passed away at the age of 62 years old. Now, Shero spent over 30 seasons in the National Hockey League. 8 of those 30 seasons were spent as the Pens general manager between 2006 to 2014. He was the architect of the 2009 Stanley Cup championship team, and he was the GM of the year in the shortened 2012-13 season, where I believe all of us will think back as one of the most exciting years of Penguins hockey during the Sidney Crosby era. You had the trades for Jarome Iginla that year. You had the trade for Brendan Morrow that year, and you had that team going on a run and unfortunately not being able to come away with the Stanley Cup. But it was some wizardry that Ray Shero pulled in that season, and really in almost every single season that he was general manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins. So our thoughts from the Tip of the Ice-Burgh go out to his family and all who were close to him. Rest in peace to a Penguins legend, former general manager Ray Shero. Now, we do have, like I mentioned, a lot to talk about, and this is the hard part about coming on here and talking about sports, is whenever there's something that's real that happens, you do have to make a hard right, and that's what we'll attempt to do. But we do have a lot to discuss throughout this episode. Make sure that you drop your questions in the comment section below, because that's how we will close out this episode, as we do every single live show on the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. But before we get into those questions, let's start with some injuries that are piling up for the Pittsburgh Penguins. The list is getting longer and longer by the day. First, we have Tommy Novak, who has missed 13 games, and that one is a real bummer, because whenever that trade went down, everybody saw Novak coming out of the deadline as the piece that is going to probably make the biggest difference for the Penguins over the next couple seasons. We got to see him for a handful of games, and he's been out ever since. 13 games missed for Tommy Novak, and still no idea as to when he could or if he will even suit up for the Penguins again this season. P.O. Joseph, meanwhile, has missed the last 17 games since that wild first period he had against the Boston Bruins, where he took out Brad Marchand by accident, and then later in the period, he was taken out by somebody on the Boston Bruins. He has since missed 17 games. Boko Imama is out for the season after having bicep surgery, which is a return timetable of 4 to 6 months. He is no longer going to return this season. And now there were 2 other players that added themselves to the injury list before yesterday's game against the Chicago Blackhawks. That's Philip Tomasino, who is suffering from a concussion, 1 game missed, and Blake Lizotte, who is dealing with a lower body injury. He has also only missed 1 game. And like I mentioned off the top of the show, we had Rutger McGroarty to the list, a name that, I mean, you don't want to see anybody get injured. When I talked about Tommy Novak, we really wanted to see what he looked like with the Penguins and if he can truly be a key piece down the middle going forward. Unfortunately, haven't been able to see that. Boko Imama was making tremendous strides, and in fact was recently, as recently meaning today, was named the Penguins Masterton Trophy nominee. And I think that is well-earned, well-deserved, and congratulations to Boko Imama for that. But it's unfortunate that he doesn't get to close out the season after he had been building so much momentum. I think he'll be back next year. I know some people disagree with that, but I think that there is certainly a place in the organization for Boko Imama. So I'm hoping that he gets a contract extension this summer. He's been missing some time. Philip Tomasino has fallen off a little bit as he's been taken out of the top 6 in favor of young guys like Ville Koivunen, who we'll talk about, young guys like Rutger McGroarty, who we'll talk about. He hasn't really been able to find his footing in the bottom 6. Now, doesn't mean he never will, but it just means that he's been struggling a little bit more than he was whenever he was playing all those games and getting all that commendation from me for the performances that he was having next to Evgeni Malkin And then, of course, Blake Lizotte has been one of my favorite players. The dude is a water bug out there. He's been one of the most consistent players the Penguins have had, maybe not on the score sheet, but with his level of play throughout this season. So it stinks to lose these guys. I'm not sure. As of right now, we have to obviously wait and see the updates on Tomasino and Lizotte. But the other three, it's hard to imagine they're going to come back in any of the next 3 games before next Thursday. Now, with Rutger McGroarty, blocked a shot on the penalty kill in the second period, was not seen from again in that game against the Chicago Blackhawks, saying he was being evaluated for a lower body injury. There were no further updates given by David Quinn, after the game. But I'm going to say this. The Penguins need this to be nothing. Injuries happen in hockey. Obviously, it's something that every team deals with. But of all the players for the Penguins to go down, McGroarty has to be at the top of the list at this time of the year, saying, man, you didn't want him to suffer an injury, and you certainly didn't want Ville Koivunen to suffer an injury, knock on wood, because he, as of right now, is healthy. But as far as McGroarty is concerned, everybody in the organization, everybody in the fan base wants to see Rutger McGroarty on this Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Penguins playoff run. Before he got called back up to the NHL a few weeks ago, he was one of their top players. He was one of their flag bearers, basically, because he was playing 20-plus minutes a night. He was playing first-line minutes. He was playing power play 1. And as we see in the NHL, he can play the penalty kill as well. So he is one of the biggest and most important pieces to that Wilkes-Barre-Scranton Penguins team, and everybody in that organization very much so wants to see that team go on a run. That's how they're going to base a lot of their decisions of this offseason off of. It's going to be how far and the performances of certain players in the Wilkes-Barre-Scranton playoff run. Now, of course, they said the same thing last year. Wilkes-Barre lost in 2 games. This year, they're hoping to go a little bit further. And honestly, they're a little bit of a better team. Last year was a lot of veterans. It was a lot of guys who had NHL experience. This year, it's a lot of young guys. Harrison Brunick is over there. Vasily Ponomarev is there. Koivunen will go back down. McGroarty, if healthy, will go back down. So you're hoping that these guys, Tristan Brose, I obviously have to mention him because he's had a tremendous season despite everything that he's been through. But they really need Rutger McGroarty to be able to, hopefully this is just something where it swelled up and they were being taking precaution with it, but you're hoping there's no broken bones, especially when you see a blocked shot to the inside of the foot like that. Now, the Penguins, as far as gameplay is concerned, they are off until Friday when they go to take on the New Jersey Devils in their final regular season road game. The Calder Cup playoffs are set to begin on the week of April 21st. So there is a little bit of time here between now and the beginning of the Calder Cup playoffs. You just hope that what happened to Rutger McGroarty was something that wasn't severe, and he will be able to be available at the very least for the start of the AHL playoffs. Now, before we get into questions, I do want to call, maybe not into question, but I do want to bring attention to something that we saw last night before the injury to Rutger McGroarty. Mike Sullivan, while the season is all but over, the Penguins got mathematically eliminated from playoff contention on Sunday in their loss to the Chicago Blackhawks. And some might say, all right, well, just pack it in, 4 games, just go through the motions, get to the offseason, and enjoy your separate vacations to each corner of the world. Mike Sullivan is still saying, hey, listen, we knew we weren't going to make the playoffs the last couple of weeks. It was a long shot. It was consistently on moneypuck.com as a 0.0 to, I think at the highest, it got to 0.2% chance. They knew they weren't going to make the playoffs. So what did they turn into? What did the call-ups of Ville Koivunen and Rutger McGroarty signal? It signaled that the Penguins are in information gathering mode. Why? Because they want to get the answers to some of the questions that they have about these kids before next season. That's what they wanted. And that's what we continued to see last night in the Penguins' 5-0 victory over the Chicago Blackhawks. Why did we see that? Well, in the beginning of the second period, it was Sidney Crosby with Bryan Rust and Ville Koivunen, who has, up to this point, played on the second line for the Penguins. When he initially came up, that was a line centered by Rickard Rakell. Now it's a line centered by Evgeni Malkin, and Koivunen has been on that second line. First power play unit, but second line at 5-on-5. He's had a couple of shifts with Crosby, but he hasn't played consistently throughout multiple periods like he did on Tuesday night. What I will say is this. It immediately created a spark. It immediately created a handful of scoring chances for the Penguins. The Harlem Globetrotter-esque passes between Ville Koivunen And Bryan Rust and Sidney Crosby, it seemed to click right away. Now, it might just be beginner's luck. It might just be the fact that they were playing the absolute worst team in the NHL over the past 3 years, but something there worked. Something there looked like it just fit correctly. And ultimately, it leads to Erik Karlsson's 200th career goal with a beautiful cross-crease pass from Ville Koivunen. He could have gone high slot to Crosby. Instead, he went cross-crease straight to Erik Karlsson for his history-making goal. And what I like is this. I like the fact that we are now going to get an opportunity, if McGroarty is okay and is able to come back in one of the final 3 games, or best case scenario, he comes back and plays all of the final 3 games. But if McGroarty is fine, what I'd like to see is this: the clear separation between a Globetrotters first line and a dirty work second line. And what I mean is this: Rickard Rakell versus Bryan Rust. One of them goes to the front of the net a little bit more often than the other. One of them drives the net a little bit more than the other. One of them has better handles than the other, although Bryan Rust's handles are not to be toyed with. They're not to be, taken lightly by anybody in the NHL. Rickard Rakell, his stick handling, just a little bit better. But if we were to see in one of the final 3 games a top 6 of this: Rakell, Crosby, Koivunen, McGroarty, Malkin, Rust, I think that would be very interesting. I think that is worth exploring. And now I called one line the Globetrotters line, and that is Rakell, Crosby, Koivunen. Not that these guys won't go to the front of the net. That's one of the things that I've loved so far about Ville Koivunen, is the fact that even if he has a slight frame, he is not afraid to go to the crease. He's not afraid to get in front of the net. He's not afraid to battle for puck positioning. He almost scored his first career goal on a handful of occasions yesterday. Why? Because he went to the front of the net. But that line screams Globetrotters. That line screams tic-tac-toe to the back of the net. I'd love to see those players get an opportunity to play together, if not for any other reason than Rickard Rakell, as we know, is noticeably better and more impactful on a line with Sidney Crosby than he is on a line with Evgeni Malkin. I understand that he's not bad with Malkin, but he is certainly much better when he plays with Sidney Crosby. So I'd like to see if Crosby, Koivunen, that magic that they showed sporadically throughout last night's game, is able to continue. And I'd like to see Rakell up there to kind of help mesh with the two of those guys. Meanwhile, on the second line, McGroarty, Malkin, Rust. As a lot of people that are really willing to hit you and really willing to do the dirty work. Bryan Rust has done the dirty work his entire career. Evgeni Malkin, maybe not as much as the other two, but he's a guy that is going to crash and bang if he can crash and bang. And since he came back from his injury, he looks like he's very willing to do so. So him, McGroarty, Rust, 3 guys that I think would work really well together. A heavy, hard checking, in McGroarty and Rust's case, very good forechecking line that I think would work very well together. So again, with the caveat being, if Rutger McGroarty is fine, if the lower body injury, the foot injury, is simply just something where there was swelling, it's just a bruise, and there's no broken bones, there's nothing else, and he's able to play in one of or all of the last 3 games, this is a top 6 that I'd love to see. So let me know in the comment section if you think this top 6 is worth exploring. I think that much is obvious, but do you think that this top 6, in my opinion, with these 6 players, I think this is the best combination of the 6 to put out there against really any given team, because I think it's a nice mix on both sides. I think there's a lot of offensive play driving on both sides, and I think the second line more so than the first, but the second line is going to be pretty good in the 200-foot game as well. Now, I'm going to take a quick break. When we return, we are going to answer all of your questions. So if you're tuned in live right now on Tip of the Ice-Burgh on YouTube, make sure that you drop a question in the comment section below. We will get to as many as we can before we head out of here today. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh live on YouTube. Make sure that if you want to keep up with all of our work, you subscribe, like, tell all your friends, all that fun stuff. It's been a weird week, so I'm a little scrambled here. But what we're going to do right now is get to all of your questions. Let you do the heavy lifting for me. Drop your question in the comment section below. We'll get to as many as we can before we head out of here today. Let's kick things off with Flux CC, who says, congratulations again, Nick. Well, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody that's throwing congrats in the comment section below. It says, are you surprised how well Rutger, McGroarty, and Ville Koivunen have seemed to fit right in to the top six? I personally was very impressed on how naturally Koivunen looked with, Koivunen looked with Rust and Crosby. Yep, and I know that you referenced the fact that I talked about this in the first segment, but it bears repeating. Like, these kids have come up and looked very good, and credit needs to go where credit is due. Mike Sullivan, Mr., as a lot of the fan base likes to call him, Mr. Doesn't Trust the Kids, has given these kids a lot of opportunities, has really extended their chances tenfold more than we've seen from any other prospects. Now, there's a couple of reasons why. One, the team is, in general, in information gathering mode. So this is what they need to be doing. And two, the level of prospect with these two is just that much higher than what we've seen from a lot of the other young kids that have gotten opportunities. They're a higher level than Sam Poulin was his last couple of stints at the NHL level. It's much higher than Jonathan Gruden was whenever he got a couple stints before being traded. So that's the reason that these guys have been getting 16, 17, 18 minutes a night, whereas before, when you saw young guys come up, maybe they'd play 8 or 9 minutes on a third or fourth pairing role or third or fourth line role. Whereas these kids right away were put next to Crosby. And at the time it was Rakell, with Evgeni Malkin eventually coming back to take over as second line center. But it is a little surprising how quickly they've adapted, right? It's not an easy thing to play with Sidney Crosby. If you look back and hear any of his former teammates talk, he demands a lot of you. I mean, Chris Kunitz has said it. Pascal Dupuis has said it. I know Tyler Kennedy most recently is who I heard it from when he was doing a guest spot on 93.7 The Fan, basically saying, listen, if you're playing with Crosby, yeah, it's fine. It's great. The fact that you're playing with an all-time great and he's going to elevate your game, but you need to be there and you need to step up to the challenge as well. And it's great to see that both of these kids have done it in a way that has been extremely effective, not against bad teams either. I understand the last two have been against the Chicago Blackhawks, but you look at who they played before that. It was the Dallas Stars, who are on an absolute tear, especially at American Airlines Center. And then it was the St. Louis Blues, who were winners of 9 straight going into that game. These kids have gone up against some really good talent that are getting ready for the playoffs, and they've been able to kind of not just stem the tide, but they've been able to drive play. You look at the St. Louis game as an example. It was Koivunen to McGroarty for the game-tying goal in the final minute of the game. So I think you have to give them all the credit in the world. And yeah, I've been surprised at how good they've been right away. But at the same time, it's exactly what the Penguins needed. They needed young kids to come up, make a difference, and plant their flag and kind of earn a spot on the roster. I'm not going to go as far as to say they've earned a spot on the roster to start the season next year, but they will be in a very good position when training camp opens for them to be able to work their way into one of those spots. And maybe it kind of changes what Kyle Dubas is looking at as far as his plans for this offseason, which I know there's a couple questions about. So we'll get to that as well. Let's go down to Evan, who says, you said last episode that you think Kyle Dubas will try pushing for the playoffs next season because it is Evgeni Malkin's final season. Hypothetically, and again, he can come back and say, you know what, I had a really good season. We got close. I'll sign another contract, and maybe the Penguins oblige and sign him to a 1-year deal. But everybody is speculating that next year will be Malkin's last. However, do you think this is the wisest choice with next year's draft being as deep as it is? I think that there's obviously conversations to be had on both. The 2026 draft is considered by many to be a deeper draft class than the 2025 draft class. But here's the thing. Going for it and pushing for the playoffs does not mean depleting all assets that he has built up over the last year. Penguins have 11 draft picks in this year's draft alone. They're going to likely use their first rounder to draft a player, but you look at all those other picks, all those late round picks, They can utilize that to help the team for next year, and it doesn't really take much away from the rebuild, considering how many draft picks they have in 2026 already and how many draft picks that they have in 2027 already. So you can do both at the same time. The thing is, Kyle Dubas, since the Jake Gensel trade, has been in hyper asset accrual mode. He hasn't made a lot of moves for the present of the Penguins. Almost every single move, I would say probably 90% without looking at a spreadsheet of every single move he's had since Gensel. But I would say probably 90% of the moves are geared towards the rebuild versus helping out this year's team. That can go down to 60-40, and that could be considered going for it next year. The Penguins, they have all that space. And yeah, the draft is very deep. But you know what else you can weaponize? Salary cap space. We talked about it yesterday. As of right now, the Penguins are projected to have $25 million in salary cap space. And the biggest free agents that they need to re-sign would be Phil Tomasino and Matt Grzelcyk. That is a drop in the bucket, even if they decide to bring those guys back. Now, Phil Tomasino is an RFA. I'd be surprised if they didn't bring him back, but Matt Grzelcyk has earned a pay increase. Is somebody else going to give it to him? Does he want to go somewhere that it's a little bit more of a clear picture that they're going to compete for a cup, or does he want to come back to Pittsburgh because that's where he revitalized his career? Don't forget, this guy was a healthy scratch on the Boston Bruins by the end of last season, and now he's having a career year. You might not like him, but the kid has turned his season around. He's turned his career around, and he's earned himself a pay increase. But even with that increase, and even with Phil Tomasino coming back, that's a drop in the bucket. And then you get into, well, if they trade Tristan Jarry, they'll have extra cap space. Well, if they trade Erik Karlsson, which we'll get to, they'll have extra cap space. Before all is said and done and they bring anybody in, they might have over $30 million in salary cap space. Utilizing that has no effect on the 2026 draft. And if things don't work out, guess what you can do? The same thing you did this year. Now, the market might not be as crazy as it was because I've never seen the trade deadline market like we saw this past year. But if you bring in that Anthony Beauvillier type to fill out the bottom six, and he has a good season on a one-year deal, guess what? You can trade a 2026 round draft pick or a 2026 draft pick to get off of him at the deadline if it doesn't work out. And if it does work out, then what are we talking about here? They get back to the playoffs. You see Malkin in the playoffs one last time. You see Crosby back in the playoffs for the first time in 4 years, and everybody's happy. FSG's happy because they're getting a little bit of that playoff revenue. So I think that when you look at pushing for the playoffs, I think it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. Kyle Dubas is still going to have an eye towards the future. He signed a 7-year contract whenever he came to Pittsburgh. The plan is not contingent upon 2025-26, but they would like to, at the very least, get that arrow pointed back in the right direction, similar to what we've seen from the Washington Capitals. Have the Capitals given up all of their assets for this year's team? No. In fact, they are still a rebuilding team. The only difference is they've started to bring in the pieces that will help them in the short term. Logan Thompson locked him up. Dylan Strome locked him up. Up comes, is it Dylan Strome? Yeah, I think Dylan Strome's the one that's there. I always get those two mixed up. Ryan Leonard is coming up. They have a lot of young guys that are supplementing this second tier of players that they have. And I think that's what the Penguins are going to start to get into. Let's go to, but with respect to, Christopher is right. Playoff run next year is too premature, but making the playoffs with everything the Penguins have at their disposal and with the East being a gong show, it's not going to be any more clear next year. I mean, you look at this season, did anybody expect Montreal to go from where they were to into a playoff spot? No. A playoff run is different. Winning a playoff series is different because they haven't done that in a very long time. But competing for a playoff spot, I don't think it is out of the realm of possibility when you consider everything that Kyle Dubas has at his disposal to add to this team this offseason. Let's go down to Zach Kemp. One of those things that he could do this offseason is trade Karlsson, and Zach asks about just that. If they can trade Erik Karlsson and are serious about the playoffs next year, should they go after Aaron Ekblad if he is available? Let me check what his contract status is. I know that he obviously isn't playing hockey right now for reasons that, you never want to see about any type of player, but he's coming off of a 8-year, $7.5 million per year contract. He will be an unrestricted free agent at the end of the season. It's interesting. I mean, that is the type of player that would really help this Penguins blue line. I mean, you're talking about their biggest weakness right now, which is their defense. And if they move off of Erik Karlsson and replace him with Aaron Ekblad, it's going to go a long way to keeping your goaltenders a little bit more, not hung out to dry. And I think that is a name that, we'll see. You take that much time off of hockey, it doesn't help. It certainly doesn't help, but I think that is a name that I would be interested in. Now, whether or not he's a fit for the Penguins, that remains to be seen. But this is a guy that has played at a very high level. This is a guy that has a Stanley Cup ring to his name. This is a guy that was a captain for the Florida Panthers for a very long time. I would be interested in Aaron Ekblad. Now, what's the number? Because the number has to fit with the Penguins as well. The term has to fit with the Penguins as well, because this is a team right now that is just getting to the end of having money tied up in players and assets that don't work, right? If they move on from Jari, that takes another contract off the board. If they move on from Karlsson, that takes another contract off the board. Ryan Graves is another one. You don't want to just automatically add one, so it has to be the right fit as well. That I'm not as sure about, but I think in general, initial thoughts, I would be interested in Aaron Ekblad if you don't have Erik Karlsson's contract to think about anymore. Let's go back to Flux CC, who says, you answered my initially planned question. Yep, we went over that. Perfect. So with this top six looking legit, do you accelerate the retool and get aggressive this summer if you're Dubas, or you stay the course? I think the course was always to get a little bit more aggressive. He's not going to swing for the fences like he did in his first offseason. And that's what I think a lot of people are hung up on is, all right, he said the next stage might be this summer. That doesn't mean the next stage is, all right, all of a sudden we're going for it again. It's going to be a repeat of 2 years ago where we paid for the highest paid defenseman, we paid for the highest paid goaltender, and we traded for the biggest name on the market. That's not going to be what we see this offseason. But I do think he's going to do more in ways of bringing in top-tier talent and going after bigger names instead of just 1 year contract here, 1 year contract here. Let's make a trade to bring in a problem contract from another team, and we'll get a second round pick with it, the Kevin Hayes deal. That's the type of stuff we saw last offseason. This offseason, I do think he's going to get aggressive because he's going to have a lot of the tools. And as far as the top six looking legit, I do like a lot of what I've seen from Ville Koivunen and Rutger McGroarty. You know what I'd like even more? If they brought in a bona fide, established top six winger to be able to bump one of those guys to the bottom six. Not because I don't think that they can play in the top six, but the Penguins' bottom six needs some consistency. The Penguins' bottom six needs a little bit of a higher ceiling than it's had in the last couple of years. You put one of McGroarty or Koivunen down there, you're giving it that higher ceiling because you're giving it a young player to infuse some life into what has been a rather lifeless bottom six for the majority of the past 3 seasons. So that's what I'd like to see. Now, again, that could be a very large amount of names. Maybe it's a guy that they draft in the top 5 and believe that he is ready. I would think it's more likely somebody else. Maybe it's a Trevor Zegras who could be on the move this summer. Maybe it's a guy like Mitch Marner who playoffs start in a couple weeks. He's not signed to a deal, and odds are that isn't going to come easily in the playoffs. If it hasn't come easily to this point, it might come in the form of a JJ Peterka, whose future is uncertain in Buffalo. So it could be a list of different names, but I do like what I'm seeing out of guys like McGroarty and Koivunen. They're looking like they can stick and be part of a successful top six for a good team, right? We've seen this season a couple of players that, well, it worked in the top six for a time. Anthony Beauvillier worked with Crosby for a time, but is that really a top-line winger on a contending team? No, it is a top-line winger on the 27th team in the NHL. You need to bring in another guy to be that bona fide, established 70 to 80 points. More would be great, but you need that type of guy if you really want to be serious about getting back into playoff contention in 2025-26. Let's go to Christopher, who says, keep Erik Karlsson until the trade deadline next year and then trade him for a 2026 first round pick. The only problem with that is the fact that I'm not sure 2026 first round picks are going to be hyper available at next year's trade deadline. And while Karlsson's value did shoot up a little bit this year because of his performance at the Four Nations, and maybe it does the same next year because of his performance at the Olympics, because he will be on Team Sweden once again, I'm not sure the market is going to be there for Erik Karlsson to go for a 2026 first round pick, because people might be hoarding onto him. Because when we're talking about Gavin McKenna, we're not talking about, I love the player, but we're not talking about Alexis Lafreniere. We're not talking about Jack Hughes. Fine players, but this is a Connor McDavid, Sidney Crosby level prospect, or at the very least, he is being touted as that. Going into next season, his draft year, he is being considered a 1.1 franchise-changing level player. Teams are not going to be hyper willing to give up that first-round pick, and that is the one problem with keeping Karlsson till then, not to mention the fact that I don't know if you can fix your defense and still have both Karlsson and Letang on the same team. I don't know if you can fix this defense with both of those guys coming back for another season. Maybe you can. I don't get paid the money to have to think about that. That's Kyle Dubas and the Penguins front office. But to me, just as a blanket statement, it feels like one of them has to go for the Penguins to be able to rebuild this blue line, because without it, it's not going to look that much different, right? If those two are still there and you're already spending $16 million on your blue line between those two players, I'm not sure who else you're bringing in that's going to be able to fix this blue line to the length and the extent that it needs to be fixed. Let's go down to Joe, who says, would you trade the Rangers first to Toronto for Marner's negotiation rights? If you know that he's going to sign, then yeah, I would trade a first for Mitch Marner. Now, here's the problem. Are they going to have to? Is he going to re-sign with Toronto? I don't know. And anybody in Toronto saying that they know are probably lying. The only people that know are probably those in the front office of the Maple Leafs, and then Mitch Marner and his agent, Darren Ferris. Now, Darren Ferris, historically, has a fun time taking his clients to the open market. We've gotten to the point where playoffs start in 2 weeks. There's a chance that Mitch Marner just goes to the open market. Now, of course, you don't get negotiation rights before everybody else, which there is some value in that. But in this situation, unless you know for a fact that Mitch Marner is going to sign a deal in Pittsburgh, and if you let him go to the open market, he's going to go somewhere else, then I don't make the move. But if you do know that and you're like, hey, listen, it's either trade the first for him and get him for next year and be able to sign him to a contract, or you let him walk to the open market and he might go some other team because he sees a brighter future with that other team, then you consider it. But I think I've talked myself out of this. I think in this moment, I've talked myself into a circle, into a knot, and then come out of it saying no, because I just don't think Mitch Marner is going to re-sign with the Leafs. I think he's going to walk. And I think if that's the case, the Penguins have as good a chance as anybody to bring him back, except for maybe the Maple Leafs, because they have the benefit of having him on the roster and can give him that 8th year. So maybe that's the reasoning. But again, I don't know if that's worth a first at this point in time. I think it might be worth something a little bit less potent than a first round pick. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see how that situation unfolds. That's one that puts my brain in a blender. I still can't believe the Leafs have let it get to this point with Mitch Marner, let alone or would consider trading his rights and just giving up on it altogether. Let's go down to Ryan, who says, who is a potential trade partner for Erik Karlsson when we take into account the salary cap? Do we need to take on a bad contract in return, or do we get or give up draft picks when we get rid of him? What is the ideal mock trade? There's a chance that you have to utilize a pick to get rid of him. And honestly, it doesn't seem like Kyle Dubas is against that. Again, outside looking in, he hasn't explicitly stated that, but that feels like the plan, especially whenever he has said a couple of times, hey, we have a lot of picks. Doesn't mean we got to use them all. I feel like that's part of what he's talking about using some of these picks for, is to offload some of the bad contracts that he has saddled the Penguins with in his early time with the organization. As far as potential trade partner, I know Jim Nill said at the deadline this year that they are not in on Erik Karlsson. that could change this summer. I think he'd be a really good fit in Dallas. Now, again, they just gave a huge contract to Mikko Rantanen, but I also think the Penguins would look to retain $2 to $2.5 million of his salary. That way, they open up $7.5, $8 million in salary cap space, which is enough room to do a heck of a lot of things. And they only saddle themselves with $2 to $2.5 million in their retention slot, which is what is immediately coming off with Jeff Petrie and Jack Johnson, I believe. No, Jeff Petrie and Riley Smith come off this offseason. So Dallas is an interesting one. You always have to look at Ottawa. That's a team that, right now has a really good young core. They're going to make the playoffs this year. What does that playoff run look like? What are they missing after that playoff run? Erik Karlsson obviously has the previous ties because that's where he cut his teeth. So you look at Ottawa, you look at Dallas, and those are the two big ones. And I don't have any other off the top of my head, but those are the two. And I think if you're the Penguins, you're looking to get rid of EK65. If you're retaining money on it, maybe you give up, Erik Karlsson and a third for a first, and maybe you do take a player back to help make the salary cap work. But I'm sure the Penguins aren't going to do it in a way of bringing back a Kevin Hayes. Like, I've liked what Kevin Hayes has done for the Penguins. I think that trade was phenomenal, but I don't think that type of player ends up in this type of trade. So those are my thoughts on Erik Karlsson, what the trade would look like, potential suitors and stuff like that. Let's go down to Evan, who says, where does Vasily Ponomarev potentially slot in next year, as Novak will likely be 3C? With all the hype over 2 and 41, it feels like he's been talked about less. He has been talked about less because he hasn't had as good of a season at the AHL level. I also don't think he's as high of a prospect as the other two. McGroarty, Koivunen, top 6 potential. Vasily Ponomarev, I think at best, I'd put him middle 6. Maybe eventually he turns into a second liner, but right now he's more destined for that third, fourth line role. And here's the thing. You mentioned Tommy Novak, Evan. There's a chance at some point next season we see exactly what we saw this season. And that's Evgeni Malkin moving over the wing and playing with Sidney Crosby in what everybody expects to be his final season. If that's the case, Tommy Novak to 2C, Vasily Ponomarev gets an opportunity at 3C. Outside of that, what does Mike Sullivan love more than anything in the world? Well, I'm sure he loves his family, his children, but as a hockey coach, what does he love more than anything in the world? Players that can play in multiple positions. One of Tommy Novak, who we've already seen play on the wing next to Evgeni Malkin, or Vasily Ponomarev would simply move over to wing. I think that's where you see him slotting in, is potentially making some noise as a bottom 6 guy. He might not start the season there next year, but I would imagine he's going to get another opportunity. He's gotten a handful of games this season. That's where he slots in. More likely a third liner than a fourth liner, but I think that he slots in that bottom 6, and he's going to be versatile in all of that. Let's go to Aiden, who says, with 3 games left, does Crosby get to 90 points? If I was a betting man, which from time to time I am, but if I was a betting man, I would bet on Sidney Crosby scoring 3 points at least in the last 3 games. I mean, it's what he does, right? Didn't we just celebrate Sidney Crosby going 20 straight seasons, having a point per game? Telling me he needs a point per game to get to 90 points? Yeah, I think I would trust Sidney Crosby to be able to do that. So I'll go out there and say yes. I'll go out there and say that Sidney Crosby does reach the 90-point plateau once again, which means it would have been 93 2 years ago, 94 last year, and at least 90 this year, which is just outright stupid consistency from a guy that is in his 35, 36, and 37-year-old seasons. The kid, I say the kid, Sid the Kid, is an absolute animal. And anybody says anything else, which I don't think anybody is brave enough to say anything different to that fact, then they're just ignorant to the fact that he is, as we talked about yesterday, Mount Rushmore of hockey level player, even at the age of 37. Let's go to the next question here from, I hope I don't get your name wrong, Tiberiu, who says, what do you think of the defense of Gavrikov Letang? I really like Vladislav Gavrikov, but Gavrikov Letang, Grzelcyk, and Peak, Pickering, and Timmins. I like it a heck of a lot more than what we're seeing right now. I mean, this defense has gone through a lot of change. It's gone through a lot of, rotating door, if you will, of people in that bottom pairing, especially even in the top 4. You have Marcus Pettersson that's been there. You have Pickering that spent 20 games there. You have P.O. Joseph that has bounced all around the lineup, and none of those 3 guys are with the NHL squad right now. One's injured, one's traded, one's in the AHL. So as far as next year is concerned, if you bring in a guy like Vladislav Gavrikov, I like that move. Give Pickering an opportunity. I like that move. Timmins, I don't know what to think about Timmins. There's some games where I'm pulling my hair out watching him play, and there's some games where I'm like, how is this guy a third pairing defenseman? How did the Penguins get him just to facilitate a trade between Boston and Toronto? But as a third pairing defenseman, it's kind of all right. He's a little bit louder than you'd like a third pairing defenseman to be. You almost want your third pairing to be non-existent, or at the very least, not notice them, not noticeable at all. But Connor Timmins and Owen Pickering as a third pairing, I could get with. I don't know enough about Peak. I haven't watched Peak enough. I think his first name is Andrew. There's a couple Peaks in the NHL, but Grzelcyk and Peak would be an interesting pair. I like bringing back Matt Grzelcyk because he has been, for a large portion of this season, the straw that stirs the drink on the Penguins power play. The reason that they have went from last year being a 30th, 31st ranked power play to this year being top 10 all season long. And right now, I believe they're in 7th or 6th place on the power play. Grzelcyk's a big part of that, and I think his defensive game has come a long way as well. So if you're bringing in Gavrikov, if you're bringing in Peak, and you're giving Pickering that opportunity, do I think that it's a great defense? No, I wouldn't go as far to say it's a great defense, but I would say it is well improved, so I do like that. Let's see. Alex brings would you rather into this scenario. Says, would you rather watch 82 games of Brock McGinn, Jeff Carter, and Kasperi Kapanen, or Nieto, Lizotte, Achari? I would much rather watch 82 games of the former than the latter. I mean, Matt Nieto had himself a pretty good game last night, but again, 82 games, that's tough. Now, Blake Lizotte, nothing against Blake Lizotte. Brock McGinn, I like Brock McGinn. He was inconsistent, and part of that in his first year was because he went through injuries, but before he went through injuries, Brock McGinn was having himself a pretty good first season in Pittsburgh. Injuries happened. He never really got back to that level. He ends up getting traded. So if I could change it, I know that's kind of against the rules. I gave you my answer. It's McGinn, Carter, Kapanen, because who doesn't love a little big Jeff Carter energy in their Penguins hockey? But if I could go McGinn, Lizotte, Kapanen, that would be best case scenario. But considering you asked for the two, I will go McGinn, Carter, and Kasperi Kapanen. Let's go to Evan again, who says, hypothetically, if the Penguins are exceeding expectations, aka in a playoff spot going into the trade deadline next season, could you see Dubas trading their first round pick for 2026 to get an upgrade in the lineup? I think it has to be, again, on its face, if you're just in a playoff spot, I don't think that's enough for Kyle Dubas to give up a 2026 first round pick in a draft that is expected to be pretty good. At least outside of McKenna, it's expected to be deeper than this year. Again, that's expectations over a calendar year out. Expectations can change. But if they're simply in a playoff spot, I don't see him trading a first rounder unless they end up with 2, right? Unless the Rangers stay where they're at right now, the Rangers decide that they're going to retain this year's first rounder because they expect to be better next year for some reason, and the Penguins end up saddled with their 2026 first. Then I could see Kyle Dubas saying, hey, listen, a first gets us a piece and a piece potentially gets us a playoff run. Then it might be worth it. But if they're simply in a playoff spot, like a wild card spot, and they only have their own first rounder, I don't see that unless the perfect piece comes along. I don't see that being something Kyle Dubas trades, at least where we sit today. Now, if they are the Washington Capitals of this year, just pushed to next year, if they're a President's Trophy team, I think that he does trade a first round pick, because at that point, you're looking at this team as a team that's expected to perform well in the playoffs, that's expected to go on a run. And if they're expected to go on a run, and Evgeni Malkin's last year, he might act a lot, Kyle Dubas himself might act a little outside of himself in that instance. But again, if it's just a playoff spot and they just have their own, I don't think, unless that perfect piece comes along, I don't think that'll be something that's on the table for the Penguins. Let's see. Bryan, who says, Mr. Nick. Ooh, Mr. I do like that. Can you recall a year where there were so many opportunities for positive change? The abundance of picks to use or trade, cap space, vet trade possibilities. I am stoked. I can't. I really can't, because most of the time, the Penguins have had big contracts, which they do have big contracts now, but not as much as they used to. Remember, Kris Letang was making upwards of $7 million. He took a pay cut. Evgeni Malkin was making $9.5 million. He took a pay cut. They were paying a good bit of money for Phil Kessel as well whenever he was here. They were paying a good bit of money for, not Brian Dumoulin. He was always vastly underpaid. But they've always had some big contracts, so they haven't had a lot of salary cap space to work with. Crosby's 8.7 was a lot larger of a salary cap hit in 2010 than it is in 2025. Substantially different. So I can't recall a year, mainly because most of my life has been spent watching the Sidney Crosby era Penguins, where they are right up against the salary cap almost every single year and signing players for longer contracts. So they haven't had this much flexibility, especially with the draft picks, because Jim Rutherford didn't like draft picks. He was actually, it almost seemed like he was offended if somebody told him, hey, you're allowed to draft somebody with those picks, right? Like, you can bring in a prospect with that. He said, no. I know what that player is. I don't know what that player is. So I'm going to trade the pick that might net me that player to get that player. That was his philosophy. So with all that in mind, it's a long-winded answer of saying, I can't recall an offseason. And I too am stoked, Brian. I'm glad that you're as excited as I am. Let's go down to Dante, who says, realistically, what picks do the Pens end up with in this year's first round, and what do they do with them if the Rangers give up first for this year? Right now, the Penguins sit in the 7th spot in the NHL draft lottery rankings. I think they're going to finish around that. There's still a possibility that the other teams below them get a couple wins and the Penguins struggle in their last couple of games and they get to 4th. I think that is ultimately the highest the Penguins are going to go, is 4th. Now, again, I don't think they're going to get there because the Penguins are playing some pretty good hockey right now, and the other teams are not. Boston is one of them, and guess what? They go head-to-head with the Boston Bruins, who have been kind of a captainless ship, as it was since they traded Brad Marchand. They've just kind of faded into obscurity this season, which is absolutely crazy considering they were a team that in January was in a playoff spot, I believe, or at the very least right outside of a playoff spot. But I think that realistically, you're going to see them finish in the 6 to 7 range, maybe even the 8 range if they win a couple of these games in the last week, because they're going up against the Caps. The Caps aren't going to have anything to play for by next Thursday. They're going up against the Bruins. The Bruins are not a great team right now. The Penguins are playing some pretty good hockey. The Penguins are trying to figure some things out. The Penguins are showing some pride, which is more than you can say about the Boston Bruins over the last couple of weeks. And then there's the New Jersey Devils, who are pretty much locked into their spot as well. So how much are they really going to go all out on Friday night? I'm not sure. So I think 6th, 7th, 8th is where we see. And I don't know what the Rangers are going to do. I don't follow the Rangers close enough to have an eye or an opinion or an educated guess on what they're going to do. But it feels like the Rangers expected much more out of this season. And it feels like because of that, they're going to expect a lot out of next season as well, which means they're going to expect to be, hopefully for them, picking 24th, 22nd, whereas this year they're going to have 10th or 11th pick. So they'll probably keep their pick and the Penguins won't have it. And if they have the 6th or 7th pick and that's it this year, they're going to draft a player. What player that is, you'll have to ask somebody else about that. I've done minimal draft work so far because my life has been turned upside down, very much so in the last couple of weeks, and I haven't gotten an opportunity to start watching some of these players. I've watched a lot of Porter Martone, and I've heard that he's starting to fall a little bit, which I would love. But I also got to watch the rest of these guys to have a full, well-rounded opinion of the top 10 going into this draft. Let's go to Dabton, who says this offseason is being dubbed the offer sheet summer. Well, maybe. After it worked out so well for the Blues last year, maybe GMs are going to be a little bit more willing to throw out the offer sheet, because that's been kind of taboo for NHL general managers for the longest time. The Blues went out and did it. to the Edmonton Oilers, getting Holloway and Broberg, and it has worked out very well for St. Louis. That's the big reason why they are in the position they're in to make the playoffs once again. But if Dubas were to use that move, who do you think he should throw an offer sheet to? Robertson and Peterka would be my two. Also, rest in peace to Ray Shero, like we started out the show with. JJ Peterka is 100% the guy. I don't think you do two. I think 2 in one offseason was crazy work and crazy business by the Blues. I think if he does it, he would do one. And if he's going to do one, man, give me JJ Peterka every single day. I like Nick Robertson. I think that Nick Robertson, if given an opportunity in Pittsburgh, would probably reach higher heights than he has in Toronto. But if I'm offer sheeting one player this offseason, I'm offer sheeting JJ Peterka. Let's go to Ryan again, who says, how do we get Ryan Graves out of Pittsburgh? Does it require a buyout? It's not happening. I'll get to the second half of your question, but a buyout would be extremely, and I can't emphasize that word enough, surprising from Kyle Dubas. He does not like that. He does not like buying players out. And the Ryan Graves buyout would not be a cheap one. It wouldn't. So I don't think Ryan Graves gets bought out. I think you're looking at Graves, if he is to be, sent out of Pittsburgh. He does have 4 years left on that contract. It's not all that expensive. He has played well for spurts this year. So maybe you find a trade partner. Maybe it's a similar situation to the Penguins last year whenever they acquired Kevin Hayes, and you have to give up a second or a third round pick to get a team to take on Ryan Graves. But I think that is probably the most realistic way that Ryan Graves ends up not on the Penguins next year. And you say, if not, would it be silly to give up as many draft picks as we could in order to get him off the books? I wouldn't say as many, but last year it was a second round pick to get Kevin Hayes off the Blues and on the Penguins. I would imagine it is similar to get Ryan Graves off the Penguins and onto a different team. I wouldn't think it's any more because Ryan Graves is younger. Ryan Graves is trending in the right direction after an absolutely abysmal year last year. And Ryan Graves has proved that if he is put in the right situation, he can play pretty well at the NHL level. Pittsburgh just has never had the right situation for him to play in, right? He's a guy that doesn't fit with a Kris Letang. He's a guy that doesn't fit with an Erik Karlsson. And when that's the case, you're not really going to get a fair shake in Pittsburgh if you don't fit with those two guys. Graves hasn't. It hasn't worked out well. Like I said, though, he has had a much better season this year. People don't want to give him credit for that because it hasn't looked perfect, but all in all, it is 5 times better than what we saw from him last season. And I know that's not much to say. But I think that's enough for other general managers to potentially, especially with the salary cap going up the way that it's going this year and expected to go up in the following years, a guy with club control, a guy that could be better if given the better opportunity. I think other teams will be interested in that. So I think maybe a second or third round pick gets you rid of Ryan Graves this offseason if the right team comes along. Let's see. Brandon says, who gets a qualifying offer out of Joseph, Bemstrom, Timmins, and Dewar? Connor Dewar might get a flat-out contract extension before we even get to the point of needing to give out qualifying offers. Connor Timmins, at the very least, will get a qualifying offer. He might get again, same thing as Dewar, might get a contract extension before we even get to that point. Bemstrom is an interesting one. I thought that they were going to let Bemstrom walk last offseason, and they didn't. So I'm not sure where they stand with that because it's not like he's come in and looked gangbusters in his opportunities here at the NHL level. He's great at the American Hockey League level. He's been a very good veteran presence for that team. So maybe that's what they value, and maybe they bring him back on that. P.O. Joseph, they didn't give him a QO last year because they didn't want to go to arbitration with him. Does the same apply this year? It depends on the other restricted free agents that are on defense and what they could potentially go for and what that arbitration number could potentially be. So I think it's all about situation. I would say they'd probably end up moving on from Joseph. They brought him in out of a necessity this year, a guy they knew when they needed some names that could go up and down the lineup. They brought him in. I think they let him go to free agency once again and try to look elsewhere because this defense, it needs some fine tuning. It needs some new names. It needs some fresh faces. And I think P.O. Joseph is a name that when he came back, yeah, he had some good stints, but he also had some really rough outings with the Penguins, similar to what we saw in his first, run with the organization. Let's go to Brandon's second pick here, or second question here. Says, could you see Heinen, Hayes, Lizotte, and Achari getting traded this summer? All have 1 year left on their contracts and could open up roster spots for call-ups and future trades. Lizotte isn't going anywhere. The Penguins really like Blake Lizotte, as they should. He's a very good piece, and we've talked about some of these pieces in the bottom six as, are they pieces for a 27th team in the NHL, or are they good bottom six pieces for a team that could make the playoffs and make some noise? Lizotte is the latter. I really like Blake Lizotte. I don't think he's going anywhere. I think the Penguins gave him a multi-year contract for a reason. He was one of a few players to actually get a multi-year contract out of Kyle Dubas on the open market last year. Kevin Hayes has been a very good veteran presence for the Penguins, very good in the room. And his contract is movable because there is retention already on it. And I don't think the Penguins would retain on it, but I think other people would see value in it. So his could go either way. Achari is an interesting one. I would, but would Kyle Dubas? That's a completely different question. And Danton Heinen, it feels like, is going to get flipped sooner rather than later. Maybe not sooner rather than later, but at some point he will get flipped because he's not going to get flipped before the season ends. I think this is an offseason where Danton Heinen might find a new home, or they might bring him back next season at the beginning of the year to battle in camp with the likes of Rutger McGroarty, with Ville Koivunen. And if he loses that battle, you put all on waivers or you look to trade him. He might be a placeholder if these young guys aren't quite ready for the NHL at the beginning of next season. Let's go down to Pittsburgh Heather, who says, do you offer sheet a goalie, Dostal or Hofer? No, I don't offer sheet a goaltender. I don't. Lucas Dostal looked gangbusters against the Penguins in the first week of the season, first 2 weeks of the season. But I don't send an offer sheet out for any of those goaltenders. I think you have to overpay when you do that, because if not, then you're just running the risk of the other team matching and you wasted your time. And you told everybody, including the goaltenders in your organization, that you want to replace them. So you have to overpay for these guys. I don't think you do that at the goaltending position simply because of who you have and how they're playing. Sergei Murashov might get his first chance at some point next season. He's way ahead of schedule. Now, I don't know how far ahead of schedule he is in the eyes of the Penguins, but there is a chance that he gets to play some NHL games next year. And honestly, I wouldn't close the door completely on Sergei Murashov potentially being the starting goaltender by the end of next season at the NHL level. It's not a likely scenario, but I wouldn't say it is completely out of the realm of possibility. If he continues to play the way that he's been playing, if he goes on a run in the Calder Cup playoffs, if he starts next season as well as he started this season, yeah, it's going to be hard for the Penguins to turn to anybody else but Sergei Murashov, not to mention the fact that it's not like they have any vacancies right now. They would have to get rid of Tristan Jarry, and we all expect them to try, but will they? Will anybody be on the other end of that phone call that'll actually take on Tristan Jarry? And the same goes for Alex Nedeljkovic. He has a year left on his contract. Plus, they got Joel Blomqvist. So I don't think I would send an offer sheet out for any goaltenders this summer. Let's go to Pittsburgh Heather again, who says, two-part question here. What is the percentage chance that Erik Karlsson is moved? Assume the Penguins would retain $2 to $3 million. And what is the percent chance that Marner would sign here? He is buds with Sid, right? That is what everybody's looking at. Very close with Sidney Crosby. Very good relationship with Kyle Dubas as well. Let's start with that one. You have to have Marner, one, elect not to go back to a Toronto team that, all intents and purposes, looks like a cup contender if they had any other logo, right? The only reason nobody is seriously considering the Maple Leafs a serious cup contender is not what they've done on the ice. It's simply the logo that they wear on their chest. Because if that logo was a spoked B, everybody would be talking about them as 1A or 1B top Stanley Cup contenders this year. Because they're the Maple Leafs, nobody takes it seriously. And nobody will take it seriously until they win not one, but two playoff series. That's when people will take the Leafs seriously. Is he really willing to leave that for a team that has missed the playoffs the last 3 seasons? Albeit a team that can make him the highest paid player, a team that can give him the contract that he probably wants, and a team that does have Sidney Crosby on it, who he's very close with and played very well with for Team Canada. Percent chance I would put on it, and I am probably more, I wouldn't say hopeful, but I'm probably more, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but I would give it 15%, and that's the highest percent chance you're probably going to get anywhere at the moment. If he gets to free agency, if we get to late June and he hasn't signed an extension, then I think that percentage shoots up a heck of a lot, because I think the Penguins are one of the few teams that will be able to, one, afford him, and two, have the ties that they do have with him. But I think as we sit here today, I'd still give it a 15% chance. As far as percent chance of moving Erik Karlsson, I'd put that a little bit higher. Now, they are not guaranteed to move on from him, so that number is not going to cross over 50% at all. Unless if it happens, clearly. But I don't think I would go over 50% unless, like, I'll believe it when I see it, is essentially what I'm saying. So with Erik Karlsson being traded, I'd put that around 35 to 40%. Just because there already was that conversation going into the trade deadline, because the cap is going up, because he has played better towards the end of this season. And obviously everybody watched what he did at the Four Nations face-off, and that significantly rose his stock around the league. I would put that at 35 to 40%. Let's go with, we only are going to get to a couple more here. Let's go with this next question here from More Hockey Cards, please. I like the name. It says, with goalies being such a gamble, don't you think it's worth drafting a late round goalie every year, or at least every other year? I mean, if the player is that good, like if the player is worth it, then yeah, you take talent. But the reality is a lot of the times, again, if there's a talented player that you believe you can turn into something special, you always take the player. The problem is goaltenders take longer to develop than, say, forwards. The speed in which players develop is forwards are the fastest. Again, general rule of thumb, not every individual situation, because every player's development is different. But generally, forwards are the fastest, defense is the second, and goaltending is the third. If you have goaltenders like Sergei Murashov, who, by all intents and purposes, was expected to be a half-decent goaltender, but when the Penguins took him, he was behind, I don't remember what year he was drafted, but Calle Clang, Joel Blomqvist, both ahead of him, right? And now you look at Sergei Murashov 2 years later, he's somebody that people are looking at and saying he's the future of the organization. So that's the reason I wouldn't take one every single year, because you don't have as many reps, right? If you bring them over, especially with the Penguins trying to do in-house development more now, bringing guys over to the AHL, you don't have as much ice time. You don't have as much opportunity at the goaltending position, because you can only play one a game. I mean, if you play two a game, typically means something has gone horribly wrong. So you can only play one a game. So you don't want to overload your roster with goaltenders. You don't want to overload your entire organization with goaltenders. But if there's talented goaltenders, of course you take them, because it is the hardest position to find. Like you mentioned, because it's a gamble, because things can go wrong. Tristan Jarry was electric in the AHL. And Tristan Jarry, for what it's worth, was really good in the NHL for stints early in his career. He hasn't been that for a large majority of the last 2 years. And that leads to the fact that you said there, it's a gamble. So while yes, if there's a talented goaltender, you take them. I wouldn't make it a habit of just saying, hey, every year or every other year, we're going to take a goaltender, because you're not letting these guys develop enough. And you might just end up giving up on one that turns into a superstar stud for another team, simply because you wanted to restart that clock. But unless we have another one here, let's go to this one here. We'll close out on this one from Brandon. I think this team needs to bring in a legit second line center. Malkin is older and misses significant time. What are your thoughts? I wouldn't say Malkin misses significant time. He has been banged up a little bit this season, but let's not forget he is coming off of 2 consecutive years where he played all 82 games. So I wouldn't say that injury issues are the chief concern with Evgeni Malkin, to me, the chief concern with Evgeni Malkin is that Father Time is sitting on his shoulder, right? There are times, the dead of winter, right? The dog days of the season, early January through, mid-February, where you could tell Evgeni Malkin, okay, the legs are a little bit slower. But whenever he's fresh, he's still a force to be reckoned with. Now, is he a top second line center? No. But as recently as last season, he was, I think, 7th among second line centers in scoring in the National Hockey League. That's still very good. It's not as good as he once was, but that is still very good for a second line center. Is he that this year? No. Do I expect him to be that next year? No. I think there needs to be, and that's where I do agree with you. I think there needs to be a contingency plan in case Malkin needs to be moved to wing like we saw earlier this season. Tommy Novak could be that contingency plan. He could be. Trevor Zegras could be that contingency plan. So while I agree, you should, I don't say you need to do it, but you should consider, if you're the Penguins, looking into bringing in somebody that could potentially fit into there. Malkin gets the first crack. Malkin gets the first crack because he's shown this season that during certain stretches, he can dominate play. He did it early in the season. He did it when he came back from his previous injury, not the one that he just came back from, but the one prior to that. He came back and he was lights out for about 4 or 5 games. He has that in him. And he has not played with consistently solid line mates all season long. That's what I want to see. If you can bring in consistent line mates for Evgeni Malkin next year, I'm not saying he's going to go out and put up 75 points again. But what I will say is he is going to be much more effective, much more consistently if he has, say, a Rutger McGroarty on his line all season long. If he has a Bryan Rust on his line all season long, instead of trying to get the best out of guys like Cody Glass, to try to get the best out of guys like Connor Dewar, who has looked good in stints, but he's not a top 6 forward. You need to surround him with consistent players and consistent playmakers the same way you've done for Crosby. Now, Crosby, it's warranted because he still has his legs. He's still playing at an elite level. While Malkin's not doing that, you could give him a little bit more help. So I think he gets the first crack at second line center, but I do agree that if a contingency plan presents itself, the Penguins would be foolish to not take a serious look at it. But that's going to do it for this live episode of the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, if you enjoy our content, to like, share, and subscribe to us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can find us anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.